One of the more contentious prophecies found in the Hebrew Bible is Ezekiel's prophecy against the island city of Tyre in Ezekiel 26, which predicts the complete destruction and obliteration of the city in the midst of the sea. But why does this prophecy of Ezekiel receive so much attention? Because of its apparent failure to come true. Despite a 13-year siege of the island city of Tyre, Nebuchadnezzar was unable to breach it, as recorded in history and acknowledged by the prophet himself in Ezekiel 29. Thus, this lengthy and detailed prophetic word pronounced against the fortress stronghold went not only unfulfilled, but was simply incorrect. Unfortunately, this failed prophecy ostensibly presents difficulties for many Christians who hold to a particular view of the inerrancy of the Bible. Because the prophet spoke for God, and God cannot lie or be in error, a failed prophecy would show the prophet to be false, or God to be in error. It is assumed by many Christians that there is either a reasonable explanation for why the prophecy did not come to pass, or that there is a fundamental misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the passage. Recently, Mr. Mike Winger has attempted to reconcile the prophecy in Ezekiel with historical data in order to justify the prophet Ezekiel and his pronouncements. While Mr. Winger acknowledges that Nebuchadnezzar did not take the island city of Tyre, he has concluded the following. 1. The prophecy in Ezekiel 26 speaks of many nations, not simply Nebuchadnezzar. This is confirmed in the passage by the change from the pronoun he to they in 26:12. The he represented Nebuchadnezzar and his armies, while the they referred to Alexander the Great, who ultimately fulfilled the prophecy when he destroyed the island city centuries later. 2. Nebuchadnezzar did lay siege to Tyre, but it was Old Tyre, or 𝀭Support, on the mainland, and not the island city of Tyre. After a 13-year siege, the Babylonian king did breach the walls of 𝀭Support, but found, much to his chagrin, that the inhabitants had been relocating with their possessions to the island city during the siege. Winger's argument rests upon two premises. The many nations and they refer to people or groups other than Nebuchadnezzar and his forces, and that the king besieged the mainland city of 𝀭Support, and not the island city of Tyre. I will argue that both of these premises are false. Nebuchadnezzar was the lone instrument of God in Ezekiel's prophecy, and he besieged and failed to breach the island city of Tyre. In this section, I will address Mr. Winger's argument concerning Ezekiel's reference to the many nations, verse 3, and the change from the use of the pronoun he to they in verse 12. As stated above, Winger argues that Nebuchadnezzar was never prophesied to be the only agent to bring about Tyre's total destruction. Many nations would come against Tyre, ultimately destroying the city and leaving it a bare rock. In Ezekiel 26:3 we read, "Therefore thus says the Lord God, I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring up against you many nations, as the sea brings up its waves." The reference to many nations, at first glance, would seem to strongly indicate that the Neo-Babylonian Empire and its armies, headed by Nebuchadnezzar, would be but the first wave to come against the city of Tyre. Were this the only phrase to go by, that would be the natural reading of the text. Several aspects of this passage, however, argue against this conclusion. First, Nebuchadnezzar is the only agent of God spoken of in the text. We will deal with the they argument shortly. Second, the description of Nebuchadnezzar and his forces in the prophecy likely coincides with the many nations. We see in Ezekiel 26:7, "For thus says the Lord God, I am bringing to Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, from the north, the king of kings, with horse and chariot and horsemen and a host of many people." There are several things to note in this transitional verse. First, the particle ki, which is for or because, directly connects the previous section to this concrete identification of the agent of the Lord, to be brought against Tyre. Second, the use of the phrase King of Kings, along with the specific identification of the various parts of the army that would accompany the king, that is, horse, chariot, horsemen, as well as a host and many people, are arguably the great nations from verse 3. In fact, the adjective many in verse 3 is the same adjective used in verse 7, Rav, to refer to the many people. This has led scholars to identify Nebuchadnezzar and his armies as the many nations in verse 3. The 𒀭Rabim, portrayed as waves beating on the rock in verse 3, are identified as Nebuchadnezzar with his title of Melech Melachim and his hosts, referred to as Kahal Wa'am Rav. Winger's argument not only requires that the phrase many nations refer to nations that would attack Tyre after Nebuchadnezzar, but also that the shift from the use of the pronoun he used in verses 7 to 11 to the use of they in verse 12 refers to the nation that would follow Nebuchadnezzar, that is, Alexander the Great. In other words, Winger does not deny that Nebuchadnezzar was the agent prophesied about in verses 7 to 11. However, in verse 12, the shift to the pronoun they refers to Alexander the Great, who would ultimately conquer the island city of Tyre. There are numerous problems with this interpretation, both with regard to parallel constructions that occur in other prophetic passages, as well as the internal logic of the prophecy in Ezekiel 26. First, there are other prophetic passages that are constructed with similar shifts in pronouns. For example, in Jeremiah 20, the priest Pashur mistreats Jeremiah, who responds with a prophetic word. In verse 4 we read, "For thus says the Lord, Behold, I am going to make you a terror to yourself and to all your friends. And while your eyes look on, they will fall by the sword of their enemies. So I shall give over all Judah to the hand of the king of Babylon, and he will carry them away as exiles to Babylon, and he will slay them with the sword." Notice that not only are the enemies plural, but the king of Babylon is the agent who will kill Pashur's friends and bring the exiles to Babylon. However, in verse 5 the text reads, "I shall also give over all the wealth of this city, all its produce, and all its costly things, even all the treasures of the kings of Judah shall I give over to the hand of their enemies, and they will plunder them, take them away, and bring them to Babylon." We know not only from this text, but from history, that Nebuchadnezzar brought the kingdom of Judah into exile, and he was the lone agent of the prophecy. Yet there is a clear change in pronoun use from he to they in the passage. If the switch from the third person singular pronoun he to the plural they does not refer to a future nation that would come up against Tyre, then to what is it referring? The internal logic of the passage makes it clear that Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers are the ones referred to as the they. In Ezekiel 26:7, Nebuchadnezzar is described as coming with his horses, chariots, cavalry, a host, and many people. He would kill the inhabitants on the mainland, set up a siege, set up battering rams, tear down the towers with swords, etc. Of course, while Nebuchadnezzar would indeed be responsible for performing these actions, as the leader of the army, it is in no way intended by the prophet that he himself would bring the towers down with a sword, or set up a battering ram. It would be the work of his soldiers. This idea is carried into verses 10 and 11, as the horses enter the city, raise a cloud of dust, shake the walls, trample the streets, and kill the inhabitants. In verse 12, the use of they simply refers to the soldiers who have just breached the city and killed its inhabitants. And they will plunder your riches and make a spoil of your merchandise. And they will break down your walls and destroy your nice houses, and throw your stones and your timbers and your debris into the water. Greenberg addresses this shift to the third person. They, Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers. The shifts in subject portray the action from different viewpoints. In G, the Greek, all the verbs of this verse are singular, continuing the person of the previous verb. Greenberg points to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of this verse, which maintains the third-person singular pronoun he, demonstrating its understanding of the agent of destruction to be Nebuchadnezzar, as in the immediately preceding verses. To briefly summarize, the first pillar upon which Mr. Winger's argument is based is the distinction that he argues for in Ezekiel 26, where the phrase many nations in verse 3 refers not only to Nebuchadnezzar and his armies, but also to Alexander the Great and his army. This is evidenced, in his opinion, by the shift from the third-person singular pronoun he in verses 7 through 11 to the third-person plural they in verse 12. However, as we have hopefully demonstrated, the many nations almost certainly refers to the many people that make up the armies of Nebuchadnezzar referred to in verse 7. Secondly, the shift in pronouns is merely a change in perspective, as the he refers to Nebuchadnezzar as the representative of the armies, while verse 12 changes the perspective to the soldiers themselves. This conclusion is supported by the reading of the Septuagint in verse 12, which maintains the third-person singular pronoun he throughout. In short, there is no reason to suggest that anyone other than Nebuchadnezzar and his armies are referred to in the prophecy of Ezekiel 26. The second pillar of Mr. Winger's argument is the identification of the besieged city of Ezekiel 26, 7 through 11, as the mainland city of 𝀭Su, or Old Tyre, rather than the island city of Tyre. Winger argues that, for 13 years, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the mainland city of 𝀭Su, which was ultimately breached. However, when he entered the mainland city, he discovered that, during the siege, the people of the city had moved secretly to the island city of Tyre, taking with them their possessions. Thus, Ezekiel's prophecy was accurate, for Nebuchadnezzar did breach the mainland city, but was unable to receive any plunder, for it had been taken to the island city of Tyre. Unfortunately for Mr. Winger, this interpretation is all but untenable for several reasons. First, the distinction between the city of Tyre as an island city and the city of 𝀭Su, the mainland city, is almost always kept distinct in the ancient sources. Thus, the judgment prophesied against Tyre by Ezekiel was clearly against the island city, evidenced not only by this ancient distinction, but by the language of the passage itself. Secondly, we know a fair amount about the mainland city of 𝀭Su and the role it played in the day-to-day life of Tyre. Although 𝀭Su likely had fortifications to protect its natural springs, it had been captured and conquered with a relatively minimal effort throughout history, even recent history from Ezekiel's perspective. Finally, the siege of the island city of Tyre was predicated upon cutting off its supply lines, which came from the mainland, particularly 𝀭Su. In other words, the siege of Tyre began with cutting off 𝀭Su from the island city. Let's examine these points in detail. The island city of Tyre was distinct from its vulnerable mainland or daughter cities, including 𝀭Su. Not long before the time of Ezekiel, the Assyrian army had laid siege to Tyre under several Neo-Assyrian kings. For example, around 671 BCE, referring to a siege of Tyre, Esarhaddon writes, "In the course of my campaign, I set up fortifications against Baalu, the king of Tyre, who trusted in his friend Taharka, the king of Cush, threw off the yoke of the god Ashur, my lord, and kept answering me with insolence. I cut off the supply of food and water that sustained their lives." Similarly, Ashurbanipal, Esarhaddon's son, described his experience with Tyre. "On my third campaign, I marched against Baalu, the king of the land of Tyre, who resides in the middle of the sea. Because he did not honor my royal commands and did not obey the pronouncements from my lips, I set up outposts against him. To prevent his people from leaving, I reinforced its garrison. By sea and dry land, I took control of all of his routes, and thus cut off all access to him. I made water and food for the preservation of their lives scarce for their mouths. I confined them in a harsh imprisonment from which there was no escape. I constricted and cut short their lives. I made them, the people of Tyre, bow down to my yoke." From these inscriptions we can see that Tyre was situated in the middle of the sea, and that a significant aspect of besieging the city was cutting off supply lines, both from the land and the sea. 🀭 represented a significant source of fresh water for Tyre, and during a siege, the invading king would begin by cutting off its supply lines to the island. Because Tyre was situated in a strategic location, the repeated military actions against it is unsurprising, as noted by Katzenstein. A repetition of events, certainly a siege against the island of Tyre, which had to start with the occupation of 𝀭, is quite normal, for a march against Philistia and Egypt had to pass this strip of country situated along the highways. As long as the Phoenician coastal towns were on friendly terms with the Assyrian king, no hostile action against them was necessary. But in alliance with Egypt, each town might endanger the long lines of communications. That 𝀭 was comparatively easy prey for invading armies can be seen in another inscription of Ashurbanipal. On my return march I conquered the city of 𝀭, Palatyrus, whose location is situated on the shore of the sea. I slew the people of 𝀭 who had not been obedient to their governors by not giving payment, their annual giving. I rendered judgment on those insubmissive people. I carried off their gods and their people to Assyria. Notice the distinction between Tyre, which is in the middle of the sea, and 𝀭, which was situated on the shore by the sea. To briefly summarize this section, there was a clear distinction drawn between the island city of Tyre and the mainland city of 𝀭, along with other mainland cities along the coast. It has also been demonstrated that 𝀭 was a source of fresh water for the city of Tyre, and because of this, among the initial stages of any siege generally included either directly controlling 𝀭 or cutting off the supply lines between 𝀭 and Tyre. Finally, the relative ease with which armies were able to conquer the cities of the mainland has been observed. The situation was no different in these respects for Nebuchadnezzar when he began his siege of Tyre around 586 BCE. Given the normal siege tactics that were historically used against Tyre, the first thing that we would expect Nebuchadnezzar to do is defeat and secure the vulnerable mainland cities, cutting off supply lines, particularly of water, to the island of Tyre. This, of course, is what we see. Block notes. The description, in Ezekiel 26, begins appropriately with the fate of the mainland Tyrian settlements, which must be the first to experience Nebuchadnezzar's attack, followed by a more detailed account of the assault on the island city itself. Katzenstein concurs. Nebuchadnezzar started a special Phoenician campaign, and apparently quickly conquered and subdued Sidon and Arvad. The mainland of Tyre was occupied by the Babylonian forces too, but the island of Tyre did not open its gates to the Babylonian king. Thus, in about 585 BCE, the 7th year of Ethbaal III, the siege of Tyre started. We must assume that the siege of Tyre was actually a blockade of the island from the mainland opposite. After the Tyrian mainland had been occupied, the siege of the island itself started. But the island was surrounded by strong and high walls, strengthened by high and mighty towers. This, of course, presents a significant problem for Mr. Winger's argument. His contention is that Nebuchadnezzar did not besiege the island city of Tyre, but the mainland city of 𝀭. After a 13-year siege, he eventually did enter the gates of 𝀭, but found that during the siege, all of the inhabitants had relocated to the island fortress. This interpretation not only flies directly in the face of what is recorded in the text of Ezekiel, which specifically differentiates between Tyre and its daughters, or mainland cities, but it contradicts this historical and logical progression of events in the siege. Even if no other historical data were available to us concerning this siege, it seems difficult to imagine that Ashurbanipal, for example, on a return from a separate campaign, could conquer the mainland coast and 𝀭, but Nebuchadnezzar and his forces could not breach the walls of this mainland city for 13 years. It seems even more fantastic to suggest that Nebuchadnezzar would only besiege the mainland side of 𝀭 under this suggested scenario, allowing, without him being aware, the inhabitants of 𝀭 to sneak out the back door, relocating with their possessions to the island. This seems all but ludicrous, particularly because of the common practice of setting up a blockade to cut off 𝑒w and the mainland city's supplies from Tyre. To sum up this section, the prophecy of Ezekiel 26 is pronounced against Tyre, the island city, and not 𝑒w, the city on the mainland. Although 𝑒w was likely fortified to protect its freshwater springs, it was vulnerable to attack and was repeatedly conquered during the first millennium, along with the other mainland cities. In fact, a siege of the island city of Tyre would begin with either conquering or isolating 𝑒w and the other cities on the mainland in order to cut off supply lines. Thus, in addition to the historical evidence available to us, as 𝑒w was weak and repeatedly conquered, and blockades were the norm when laying siege to the island, it is extremely unlikely that Nebuchadnezzar would lay siege to 𝑒w, and only from one side, allowing its inhabitants to sneak out of the city and flee to Tyre during the 13-year siege. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, laid siege to the city of Tyre following the fall of Jerusalem, and the prophet Ezekiel dedicated a lengthy section of his writings to oracles against this island city. In chapter 26, he prophesied the complete destruction of Tyre. However, this prophecy did not come to pass. It has been argued by Mike Winger that the prophecy did not fail, but rather referred to two separate agents of Yahweh's destruction, Nebuchadnezzar and Alexander the Great. Mr. Winger argues for this interpretation based on the phrase many nations and the shift in pronouns from he to they in verse 12. Furthermore, he argues that Nebuchadnezzar did not besiege the island city of Tyre, but the mainland city of 𝑒w. I have attempted to demonstrate that neither of these conclusions are justifiable. First, the agent referred to in chapter 26 is Nebuchadnezzar alone, and attempting to assign any portion of the prophecy to a later agent is extremely problematic. The many nations very likely refers to Nebuchadnezzar and the vast hosts that he brought against Tyre, and the shift in pronouns was identified in other prophetic passages that clearly refer to only one referent. It is almost certain that the they refers not to some future nation, but to the soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar, shifting the perspective of the text, evidenced by the continued use of the singular he in the Septuagint. Finally, I sought to demonstrate that the normal and historical process of besieging Tyre began with conquering or isolating the mainland cities, particularly 𝑒w, as it was a supply line for food and fresh water for the island. It seems highly unlikely that, having been easily and repeatedly conquered by previous kings, 𝑒w would not only hold out a siege by Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years, but would be able to leave the city to flee to the island city of Tyre. This brief analysis of Mr. Winger's argument should be considered in no way exhaustive. Further analysis of the literary structure of chapter 26, Ezekiel's reaction and amended prophecy in chapter 29, and the failed Egyptian prophecies of chapters 29 and 30 are also significant aspects of this discussion. However, this paper is intended to address the two primary arguments upon which Mr. Winger's interpretation rests. However one interprets the prophetic work of Ezekiel, it should be done with as strict an adherence to the historical and linguistic context of the book as possible. It is my hope that this short paper has provided an example of how to approach a difficult text in this way.